Our next speaker is really I really have the honor to introduce to you tonight one of our renowned peace leader and mediator who actually keeps the world go round and continuously rotating despite the chaos and violent conflicts happening. Miss Julia Roig is actually the president of PartnersGlobal, and what she loves and she's passionate about is really to talk with people. And as you can see from the screen, she loves to listen to diverse organizations. She loves to share new innovative concepts, strategies, and hear their problem, and together love to explore meaningful ways of addressing chaotic situation. She actually loves to innovate approaches. And that's why her session tonight is really very adept to discuss about adaptive leadership for peace organization. And so, dear colleagues, let me introduce and please help me welcome Julia Roig. Julia, over to you.
Thank you so much. And what a wonderful introduction, seeing all these fun pictures of myself. And I'm saying an early good morning to all of you from the eastern shore, the coast of the United States. I'm here in the state of Maryland. And I'm so glad that you invited me to attend and to join you for this time. And after seeing all those fun pictures of your previous conferences, I'm definitely going to show up in person the next time you do it because it looks like a great time. So I'm also going to share my screen because I do have a couple of slides to share with you today. And basically, as I understand it, we're going to have a conversation for about 30 minutes where I'm going to talk to you about adaptive leadership. And then we'll definitely have time for lots of question and answer afterwards. So once again, thank you so much for the invitation. So as was mentioned, I am the president of PartnersGlobal, based here in Washington, D.C. We used to be Partners for Democratic Change. And if you don't know about the organization, we just celebrated our 30th anniversary. So we've been around for a while. And we function as a network. So there are 22 partners centers around the world that we in the United States have helped to set up over the years. They're completely independent, autonomous, nonprofit organizations that share a brand. So Partners Georgia, Partners Albania, Partners Colombia. We've collectively done a lot of work in your region, although as of now, we don't have any network members in Asia. And we'd love for that to change. So I'm looking forward to continuing to be in close communication with many of you. But so over the years, we've been an organization that's helped to build other organizations to then be committed to ongoing peace building and good governance work, to be that kind of neutral platform to house the kinds of work that we know is needed in all countries in transition, facing conflict. And over the years, our work has really changed, quite honestly. The network itself has been an important kind of platform for learning, but we've also started really focusing on essentially building up and sustaining what already exists, not necessarily building new organizations. So this topic of resiliency has been on our minds for a long time. And because we feel that as a network, we've been staying resilient through lots of different political changes, social changes. And it's a very sexy topic right now. We're hearing a lot about resiliency, but for many years now, almost 5 years together with the other civil society network, Civicus, we developed a resiliency framework to help specifically organizations working in the kinds of democracy and governance and peace building work to help them be able to sustain big shocks to their system. Shocks, what does that even mean? Well, we just had a global pandemic. It's a good example of a shock. And so therefore, we've got 7 factors in this framework. One of the factors is our capacity to be adaptive. And so that's what I wanted to talk a little bit more today. I'm not going to talk about the whole resiliency framework, but we've really found that the ability to be adaptive is a key factor, obviously, of staying resilient as an organization. So I thought I'd go through each of the points in the title just very briefly about why do I feel it's important to focus on organizations in particular. Because, you know, I was reflecting on the fact that many people in our field, professionals, you know, amazingly dedicated and experienced peace builders have never been taught how to be a manager. I don't know about you, I went to law school. No one ever taught me. I never thought that I would be the head of an organization. And, you know, we study international relations, we study psychology, we study education, we come from academia. You know, being the head of a nonprofit is actually a struggle and a kind of a science in and of itself, isn't it? And peace building and peace builders need strong organizational platforms to continue to sustain our work, because governments will come and go. We know that, you know, our commitment to building peace is a long-term one. And so obviously we want to have really strong organizations that are well-funded, well-staffed, that can continue to do the work. And especially now, and I don't know about your region, we're seeing a lot of peace building organizations struggle to maintain their operations, especially when funding priorities change. You know, the world is very worried about public health right now. They're worried about economic development. So maybe some of the funding for our work is going to be changing. So why leadership? And what do I mean by leadership? This is kind of a stereotypical kind of big red ball at the head of a bunch of other people, supposedly having all of the answers and saying, this is the direction we're going to go. You know, the concept of leadership is changing. And I think that we're all trying, and if we're not trying, we should be trying to figure out what do non-hierarchical structures of leadership look like. So I am talking about leadership at all levels of the organizations that we work with. And I'm really talking about a concept of shared leadership. Many of us perhaps have grown up in hierarchical structures, maybe starting with the family, maybe starting with how our schooling system worked. And so I think we follow what we know and what we think it means to be a good leader. But part of adapting is getting out of those kind of traditional leadership ways of thinking. And then finally, why adapt? Everybody's talking about a new normal. I don't know if this is so new. I think maybe it was always like this, in the fact that, you know, we thought, you know, the road ahead of us was kind of a straight line, even when we're dealing with conflict dynamics. You know, we do have a sense somehow that the world is changing at a more rapid pace. And so this ability to adapt and then put into practice adaptive skills, I think that these are some of the leadership skills of the future. Okay, so let me get straight into what I'm talking about then. One of the kind of founding principles of adaptive capacity, also, you know, if you study any kind of systems leadership or systems theory, it's very similar, that, you know, the difference between dealing with something that's complicated versus problems that are complex, and then how do we plan to address those? You may have heard about clock problems. and cloud problems, for example. That's the systems theory concept, that a complicated problem is one that has a lot of moving pieces, but you know what those pieces are, and you can one by one start putting the pieces back together. If you took apart a clock, you could put the clock back together. And sometimes I think about this, for example, you know, we want to maybe have a peace curriculum in a school. You know, depending on the size of the school system, depending on the different stakeholders who need to approve, you know, looking at kind of the grade level, you know, we can solve that problem. We can design a good curriculum for students. We can get the right people to sign off on it. It may be a very complicated kind of policy dynamic, different teachers, different stakeholders, but we could solve that problem. Complexity, on the other hand, is something we can't get our hands around, and that's why they call them cloud problems. You can't really get your arms around a cloud, and you can observe a cloud, the cloud goes by. And so a complex problem might be more like we're trying to address misinformation right now. We're trying to figure out, how do we deal with the fact that both kids and our societies are just marinating in a diet of misinformation. And we think that a really good school curriculum might solve that problem. And we want them to, you know, potentially learn better, you know, discernment, media literacy. And yet, you know, there are so many other elements. How media is paid for by advertising, and so the number of clicks, all of the different people who benefit from the misinformation. There's all of the brain science behind why it is that we believe things or don't believe things. I think addressing this kind of misinformation ecosystem is a very complex problem. It doesn't just take putting the different pieces and then solving it. We're always having to observe what's happening, observe with others, maybe try and address one piece of it and see what effect we have on that. But it's going to be constantly adapting and evolving. The idea is that complexity doesn't really have order, and it doesn't have predictability, because there's so many pieces. The pieces of the problem are going to be potentially interacting with each other in unpredictable ways. So the reason I wanted to talk about the difference between complicated and complex is I think sometimes our organizations are set up as if we're only dealing with complicated problems because we like, for example, to do strategic planning. We like to have strategic planning for like 3 to 5 years. We like to say we're going to do A, we're going to do B, we're going to have our results framework, we're going to do X, then Y is going to happen. We'll have kind of our hypotheses. And we actually have to structure our organizations differently if we're going to be trying to solve complex problems, or not really even solve them. They say, stop trying to solve them. We have to manage what's happening now, which is a little bit less certain. And of course, the way that our donors fund our work, we have to overpromise. We have to say we're going to be, solving things. It's much more different. So if we're dealing with issues like climate change, and what I was reflecting on is I do think peace builders are good at this. I think that we apply this frame of mind to our work because we understand that conflict is messy. It's not a straight line. When we're in the midst of a group dynamic, we understand all of the different human elements, and yet applying these concepts to ourselves internally in the way that we manage and we design for programs and we work with our teams and we partner, I've at least observed that we manage ourselves as if we're only dealing with complicated problems. And so I think that a little bit of self-awareness to take what we naturally do externally and try and apply it in our own organizations is part of bringing adaptive capacity into our organizational structures. So there's three things that I'm going to talk about. Because what do we do with this? I mean, if this is, our world, if we think that the world is more volatile than normal, what is normal than before? I've had lots of colleagues say, is the pace of change really picking up that much, or do we just know about it because of all of the different media outlets that we have? It doesn't matter. It feels like the world is, the complexity of the problems and the challenges that we're facing feel overwhelming, I think. So whether it's a pandemic, whether it's climate change, whether it's, big seismic shifts in geopolitics that affect us at a very local level, we have to figure out what to do with this. So I want to talk about three aspects of adaptive leadership then. One is, I do think that there is internal work with regards to kind of how we individually change our mindset. I think there's a very specific shifts in practice of things that we can do differently. And then I'm a big believer that we shouldn't be doing any of this alone, that we need to think differently about who we partner with in order to kind of embed this adaptive leadership into the way we work. Okay. So starting out with mindset shifts then, I did not use this, I can't claim this phrase, but somebody once said that curiosity is a superpower. And I totally love that. And, staying curious about the problems that we somehow are trying to face, but also staying curious with regards to what's going on in our own organizations. And this is why I wanted to mention kind of traditional leadership models of someone who needs to have all the answers. I think a vulnerable leader maintains that level of curiosity to even acknowledge, like, maybe I don't have all the answers. And so, there is a mindfulness aspect of curiosity, which is to make sure that, all of the voices on our teams are actively participating in observing this complex system. And so to the extent that part of your mindfulness is essentially understanding kind of your own biases and to be more situationally aware. And what I would like to say is, when we're really busy and when we're really stressed, I think that those are the aspects of our practice and our mindset that are the first to go. There's this kind of cult of busyness of just, getting through our to-do list. And so staying curious also, essentially includes empathy, doesn't it? That we not necessarily have to put ourselves in someone else's shoes, but that we have to have empathy to potentially understand how somebody might be experiencing whatever set of problems are that you're dealing with in a different way. And again, I'm not talking about our work as peace builders, because again, we're really good at this. We facilitate people having empathy for each other when we're mediating. And yet getting into our own organizations and then feeling the responsibility of what we think it means to have a direction, I think that then the empathy is maybe harder to embed into the organizational culture. One of the things that I love at the end of every meeting, someone told me once that we should ask, what hasn't been said that still needs to be said? And it's a way of making sure that, that the different voices and different talents have this space to participate. And then finally, a part of being curious is staying humble. There's a humility, isn't it, to accept yourself, not necessarily think less of yourself, as the C.S. Lewis quote says. He talks about humility isn't thinking less of yourself, it's just thinking less of thinking of yourself less. We talk about this as being potentially kind of a gendered capacity, but I don't think that that's true. I think that the act of being vulnerable within our organizations to have that curiosity really is a superpower, because new understandings emerge, which is desperately what we need when we're trying to get our hands around those cloud problems. So then sense making. I love this term because it's different from problem solving. And we're taught problem solving. It's one of the kind of 7 steps of kind of the Harvard negotiation model, isn't it? You know how to brainstorm, we define the problem, we come up, you know, with various solutions, then we look at and evaluate the solutions together, and we pick one and we move forward. We've got an agreement. And then sense making is a totally different action of how are we collectively making sense of this volatility and this complexity. And so, you know, problem identification, again, goes to this concept potentially of a complicated problem that just needs to find the right solution. And when we're making sense, again, let's say of an ecosystem that's causing polarization to take place. I mean, this is a problem all over the world right now. Why are we becoming more and more polarized? And lots of people want to talk about social media, want to talk about politicians that polarize us, that there's, you know, aspects of manipulation, but, you know, it's a very complex problem that we're trying to make sense of. And so then when we go through the act of trying to make sense, again, through those conversations, through the reflections, through the observation, we have to be comfortable with not being totally accurate. So sense making isn't like we will never know all the aspects of complex problems, and we won't have the complete picture. So we have to also then be comfortable defining an action without having such accuracy if we're just trying to make sense. Because then it becomes, well, you know, what's plausible, and almost like, is it sufficiently plausible that part of the problem is social media? And that is why we're becoming more polarized, because we can't know everything. And so the way that we have the conversations to allow ourselves to not have all the information to then decide how to act. And again, maybe it's a curriculum on media literacy that we've decided we're going to try and act on that polarization because we think that that's going to be part of the solution. Then we're continuing to make sense and observe, well, how is that having an effect on the communities that we're working in? And then finally, foresight. You know, I know that sounds like a funny mindset shift, but, you know, again, I think that we're really good at this as peace builders, because we do think about peace being in the long term. We're working for long-term change. Sometimes we're thinking in terms of generations. And yet, how we apply that concept into our own organizational practice and our own mindset of saying, and again, I know that our funding structures sometimes force us into kind of 6-month, 1-month kind of program cycles, but we do have to be futurists. I think we all have to be futurists now to be thinking about what we're doing today and the likely scenarios of what might be happening in the future, because it helps us make sure that we don't just do the same thing we've always done. None of us thought that we would be working so remotely. And, you know, wherever you are in your different countries, you know, you probably had some experience with being locked down, quote unquote, working from home. And, you know, how much had we been prepared for that? Some organizations were better prepared than others. I don't think we ever would have thought we were in a pandemic. Some people did. But part of this kind of foresight, part of the kind of forward thinking is thinking about, well, what are the trends that are coming that I need to be preparing for now? And I know a lot of organizations that were much better prepared for everybody teleworking than others. Now, you know, we can't blame them for not knowing that a pandemic was coming, but understanding that technology is going to be a bigger part of our work life, that we need to be, more forward thinking and incorporating that is part of applying kind of a foresight mindset. Okay, I'm moving on. I've got 10 minutes for the last two concepts. So adaptive practices then. So what are we incorporating into our daily life within our organizations? I think transparency is key. A lot of us work for transparency. We think of transparent governance as one of kind of the key kind of concepts of building a peaceful society. How we apply those transparency practices within our own organizations is one of adaptive. The ability to adapt is that everybody needs to have the same information. So why are we making decisions that we're making? How are they being made based on what criteria? So once again, that you have the ability to have that kind of great group think, and that we're much more inclusive with different thoughts. And, we think of inclusion sometimes in terms of ethnic diversity. We think of racial diversity in the US. We think of kind of the gender balance. I have been thinking more and more about age diversity. And it's something I struggle with, quite honestly, because there is a real difference between how younger people in my organization and in the network think about their work life and think about themselves at work, and the kind of decision-making role that they're claiming as young people. And, again, those stereotypical leadership models, you have to pay your dues, you're not as experienced as those of us who have been around for a while. And so there's a little bit of, know your place. And then, I've got these young people who are just energetic and excited and claiming leadership, not even asking for it. And so I have observed a lot of intergenerational tensions. And so I've been really in favor of those who are in kind of more traditional leadership models, trying to figure out what that inclusiveness within our organizations, because I think there's a little bit in the peace building field right now, kind of a cult of youth, like youth need to be leading peace building efforts. And so we support youth organizations and youth movements. But what does it look like when we're working together between generations? I think that that's something that we need to be better at. And then finally, I had mentioned this kind of, we all need to be futurists now. What does scenario planning look like? We at Partners don't do a strategic plan anymore, honestly. Partially because I feel like after 6 months, it's not relevant anymore. So we have something called a mission action plan. So our mission is pretty strong still. We're working to support civil society activists around the world to be better connected and integrated with each other and with other partners. It's our name. But we have to run scenarios. What do we think is going to happen a month from now? What do we think is going to happen 2 months from now, 6 months from now? And what's the best case scenario? Again, we're in peak uncertainty right now with the pandemic, but I think we're going to be in peak uncertainty for a long time. And so there's all sorts of scenario planning tools out there, and I'll share some of the tools that we have available at Partners that can help you. Really simple kind of formulas that can help you think at the organizational level, at the operational level, programs, strategy. Where do we think we're going, and how do we plan for these different scenarios unfolding? Because finally, what I want to say is none of us should be doing this alone. We should not be sitting alone in our own organizations doing scenario planning, because we don't have all of the information. And again, the example of misinformation, of if we're trying to work on that issue, we're trying to work on polarization, we may think the right way of depolarizing is we need to get people from different sides to come together to dialogue with each other. And you know, honestly, some of the polarization research says that's the thing not to do. It actually entrenches people in their polarized side even more. And so there's some sacred cows, I think, of the peace building field that we do need to be reflective of. Do we keep doing the same things without really thinking deeply about the impact in this kind of new environment, these new scenarios, these new inputs? And the only way we're going to get that is by talking to different people who see a different side of this. So, you know, with regards to partnerships, I believe that we adapt better when we're also faced with kind of different thinking outside of our organization, but also within our professional community. And so we run a lot of scenario planning exercises with groups of organizations on a regular basis, and you know, look at future trends. But then, you know, honestly, I also am a big proponent in partnering with organizations that we wouldn't necessarily think of as peace building organizations. So, you know, there's a big push for kind of business for peace right now, and how can businesses be contributing to peace? And I teach a lot of graduate students on business for peace and how to partner with peace builders and businesses, and I get sometimes a lot of pushback. You know, that, you know, those are the folks that are greedy, that they're the ones, you know, causing problems with regards to whether it's, you know, social injustice and inequalities and the things that we're all trying to work to solve, and making really blanket generalizations about, you know, media companies, for example. So, you know, media that, you know, is part of the problem, you know, because of their business model. And so I think finding the right partnerships of who could potentially be considering themselves a part of our goals, and maybe even push us to see what we do and how we do it in different ways, that's going to be the only way that we adapt. And so I always ask people to check their own biases about who they think should be partnering with us. My sister works for a dairy company on the West Coast of the US. And it's a really well-known dairy company. They make cheese, they make yogurt. And, you know, so when we talk about kind of the business community, they're very active in the state of Oregon, right north of California, if you don't know where it is. And they are one of those kind of corporate citizens. So meaning they bring together kind of workers from different sides of the state. They've been very involved in different dialogue and education efforts. And I think, you know, they're committed, you know, to sustainability and the environment. They're worried about the ecology in the state. There's those kinds of partnerships that are going to help us think about how we're going to continue to adapt and ask ourselves the hard questions about how we do our work. Okay, so this is my last point. I've got 3 minutes left and I'm ending right at the half-hour mark, and then we can have a conversation. You know, all of this adapting is exhausting. It truly is. And you know, I really start with like, we have to take care of ourselves, because I really had a lot of, again, empathy for some colleagues of mine who said they just felt like they had transition fatigue. And, you know, when was Partners going to just get in a flow? When I say PartnersGlobal, when were we just going to stop being in transition? And, you know, we're just never not in transition. So what does that mean? You know, it's very hard on our brains to constantly being tasked with not knowing exactly, you know, what's next, what can we expect? We know it like actually physically hurts kind of our cognitive abilities. And so whatever you have to do to take care of yourself, you can't be an adaptive leader within your organizations. You can't do your work. You know, we know, again, dealing with trauma, you know, dealing with the healing kind of work that we do externally. I think we've been talking for a long time about how peace builders apply that kind of healing to ourselves. And I'm just giving you another reason to do that. And it's because we are going to be in this adaptation business for a long time. So we have lots of resources at Partners Global on resiliency, on adaptive leadership, on all of these different aspects, scenario planning, future trends, all of those different mindsets, lots of videos. Please follow us on social media, it's all up there. And we're really happy to continue to be in conversation with you all. So with that, shall I stop sharing my screen, do you think? And we could just have a conversation?